Musculoskeletal system. Frontal plane. Frontal plane. Median plane. Median plane. Sagittal plane. Sagittal plane. Transverse plane. Transverse plane. Superior. Superior. Cranial. Cranial. Cephalic. Cephalic. Inferior. Inferior. Caudal. Caudal. Anterior. Anterior. Ventral. Ventral. Posterior. Posterior. Dorsal. Dorsal. Medial. Medial. Intermediate. Intermediate. Lateral. Lateral. Proximal. Proximal. Distal. Distal. Superficial. Superficial. Deep. Deep. Supine. Supine. Prone. Prone. Periosteum. Periosteum. Compact bone. Compact bone. Spongy bone. Spongy bone. Cancellous bone. Cancellous bone. Endosteum. Endosteum. Medullary cavity. Medullary cavity. Bone marrow. Bone marrow. Red bone marrow. Red bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow. Bone shaft. Bone shaft. Diaphysis. Diaphysis. Epiphysis. Epiphysis. Metaphysis. Metaphysis. Epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal line. Epiphyseal line. Osteocyte. Osteocyte. Osteoblast. Osteoblast. Osteoclast. Osteoclast. Chondrocyte. Chondrocyte. Chondroblast. Chondroblast. Long bone. Long bone. Short bone. Short bone. Flat bone. Flat bone. Irregular bone. Irregular bone. Sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bone. Cranium. Cranium. Cerebral cranium. Cerebral cranium. Frontal bone. Frontal bone. Parietal bone. Parietal bone. Occipital bone. Occipital bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone. Sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone. Ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone. Facial bone. Facial bone. Maxilla. Maxilla. Maxillary bone. Maxillary bone. Zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone. Nasal bone. Nasal bone. Lacrimal bone. Lacrimal bone. Palatine bone. Palatine bone. Inferior nasal conchus. Inferior nasal conchus. Vomer. Vomer. Mandible. Mandible. Hyoid bone. Hyoid bone. Cranial suture. Cranial suture. Sagittal suture. Sagittal suture. Coronal suture. Coronal suture. Lambdoid suture. Lambdoid suture. Fontanelle. Fontanelle. Anterior fontanelle. Anterior fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle. Vertebral column. Vertebral column. Vertebra. Vertebra. Cervical vertebra. Cervical vertebra. Thoracic vertebra. Thoracic vertebra. Lumbar vertebra. Lumbar vertebra. Sacrum. Sacrum. Coccyx. Coccyx. Thorax. Thorax. Thoracic cage. Thoracic cage. Rib cage. Rib cage. Sternum. Sternum. Costal bone. Costal bone. Rib. Rib. True rib. True rib. False rib. False rib. Floating rib. Floating rib. Costal cartilage. Costal cartilage. Shoulder girdle. Shoulder girdle. Clavicle. Clavicle. Scapular. Scapular. Humerus. Humerus. Radius. Radius. Ulna. Ulna. Carpal bone. Carpal bone. Metacarpal bone. Metacarpal bone. Phalanx. Phalanx. Pelvis. Pelvis. Hip bone. Hip bone. Ilium. Ilium. Ischium. Ischium. Pubis. Pubis. Sacrum. Sacrum. Coccyx. Coccyx. Femur. Femur. Patella. Patella. Tibia. Tibia. Fibula. Fibula. Tarsal bone. Tarsal bone. Calcaneus. Calcaneus. Metatarsal bone. Metatarsal bone. Phalanx. Phalanx. Synarthrosis. Synarthrosis. Suture. Suture. Gomphosis. Gomphosis. Syndesmosis. Syndesmosis. Amphiarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis. Synchondrosis. Synchondrosis. Symphysis. Symphysis. Diarthrosis. Diarthrosis. Ellipsoidal joint. Ellipsoidal joint. Plane joint. Plane joint. Ball and socket joint. Ball and socket joint. Cotyloid joint. Cotyloid joint. Pivot joint. Pivot joint. Hinge joint. Hinge joint. Saddle joint. Saddle joint. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage. Fibrous cartilage. Fibrous cartilage. Joint capsule. Joint capsule. Joint cavity. Joint cavity. Synovial membrane. Synovial membrane. Synovial fluid. Synovial fluid. Ligament. Ligament. Bursa. Bursa. Meniscus. Meniscus. Tendon. Tendon. Aponeurosis. Aponeurosis. Fascia. Fascia. Carpal tunnel. Carpal tunnel. Contraction. contraction, relaxation, relaxation, abduction, abduction, adduction, adduction, flexion, flexion, extension, extension, hyperextension, hyperextension, elevation, elevation, depression, depression, rotation, rotation, circumduction, circumduction, supination, supination, pronation, pronation, dorsiflexion, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, plantar flexion, eversion, eversion, inversion, inversion, temporomandibular joint, temporomandibular joint, atlanto-occipital joint, atlanto-occipital joint, atlantoaxial joint, atlantoaxial joint, intervertebral joint, intervertebral joint, facet joint, facet joint, sacroiliac joint, sacroiliac joint, sternoclavicular joint, sternoclavicular joint, chromioclavicular joint, chromioclavicular joint, shoulder joint, shoulder joint, glenohumeral joint, glenohumeral joint, scapulothoracic joint, scapulothoracic joint, elbow joint, elbow joint, humeroradial joint, humeroradial joint, humerulnar joint, humerulnar joint, wrist joint, wrist joint, radiocarpal joint, radiocarpal joint, intercarpal joint, intercarpal joint, carpometacarpal joint, carpometacarpal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, interphalangeal joint, interphalangeal joint, hip joint, hip joint, knee joint, knee joint, tibiofemoral joint, tibiofemoral joint, patellofemoral joint, patellofemoral joint, ankle joint, ankle joint, talocrural joint, talocrural joint, intertarsal joint, intertarsal joint, tarsometatarsal joint, tarsometatarsal joint, metatarsophalangeal joint, metatarsophalangeal joint, lumbago, lumbago, coxagodynia, coxagodynia, ostalgia, ostalgia, osteoragia, osteoragia, crepitation, crepitation, syphilitic pseudoparalysis, syphilitic pseudoparalysis, sequestration, sequestration, supernumerary bone, supernumerary bone, phantom limb pain, phantom limb pain, callus, callus, delayed union, delayed union, non-union, non-union, malunion, malunion, arthralgia, arthralgia, ankylosis, ankylosis, arthrogryposis, arthrogryposis, hemarthrosis, hemarthrosis, hydrarthrosis, hydrarthrosis, tophus, tophus, osteitis, osteitis, osteomyelitis, osteomyelitis, periostitis, periostitis, epiphysitis, epiphysitis, spondylitis, spondylitis, pot disease, pot disease, Paget disease, Paget disease, coccitis, coccitis, phalangitis, phalangitis, osteoporosis, osteoporosis, osteomalacia, osteomalacia, scurvy, scurvy, rickets, rickets, osteoma, osteoma, exostosis, exostosis, osteosarcoma, osteosarcoma, Ewing tumor, Ewing tumor, chordoma, chordoma, multiple myeloma, multiple myeloma, fibrosarcoma, fibrosarcoma, simple fracture, simple fracture, closed fracture, closed fracture, compound fracture, compound fracture, open fracture, open fracture, comminuted fracture, comminuted fracture, impacted fracture, impacted fracture, complete fracture, complete fracture, incomplete fracture, incomplete fracture, greenstick fracture, greenstick fracture, compression fracture, compression fracture, depressed fracture, depressed fracture, pathologic fracture, pathologic fracture, Coles fracture, Coles fracture, Smith fracture, Smith fracture, pot fracture, pot fracture, achondroplasia, achondroplasia, amelia, amelia, dysostosis, dysostosis, spondylolysis, spondylolysis, spondylolisthesis, spondylolisthesis, spinal stenosis, spinal stenosis, kyphosis, kyphosis, lordosis, lordosis, scoliosis, scoliosis, spina bifida, spina bifida, spondylomalacia, spondylomalacia, talipes, talipes, talipes planus, talipes planus, flat foot, flat foot, talipes cavus, talipes cavus, clawfoot, clawfoot, talipes valgus, talipes valgus, talipes varus, talipes varus, genu valgum, genu valgum, genu varum, genu varum, hallux valgus, hallux valgus, hallux varus, hallux varus, coxa valga, coxa valga, coxavara, coxavara, syndactyly, syndactyly, polydactyly, polydactyly, arthritis, arthritis, pyogenic arthritis, pyogenic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, osteoarthritis, degenerative arthritis, degenerative arthritis, gouty arthritis, gouty arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, Ankylosing spondylitis. Rheumatism. Rheumatism. Synovitis. Synovitis. Tendinitis. Tendinitis. Tenosynovitis. Tenosynovitis. Fibrositis. Fibrositis. Bursitis. Bursitis. Dislocation. Dislocation. Subluxation. Subluxation. Sprain. Sprain. Strain. Strain. Disc extrusion. Disc extrusion. Muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy. Bunion. Bunion. Frozen shoulder. Frozen shoulder. Tennis elbow. Tennis elbow. Chondroma. Chondroma. Chondroblastoma. Chondroblastoma. Chondromatosis. Chondromatosis. Chondrosarcoma. Chondrosarcoma. Synovioma. Synovioma. Chondrectomy. Chondrectomy. Chondrotomy. Chondrotomy. Osteotomy. Osteotomy. Craniotomy. Craniotomy. Sequestrectomy. Sequestrectomy. Amputation. Amputation. Bone graft. Bone graft. Closed reduction. Closed reduction. Open reduction. Open reduction. Arthrotomy. Arthrotomy. Arthroscope. Arthroscope. Arthroplasty. Arthroplasty. Arthrectomy. Arthrectomy. Arthrodesis. Arthrodesis. Bunionectomy. Bunionectomy. Arthrocentesis. Arthrocentesis. Tenorrhaphy. Tenorrhaphy. Striated muscle. Striated muscle. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle. Visceral muscle. Visceral muscle. Voluntary muscle. Voluntary muscle. Involuntary muscle. Involuntary muscle. Muscle bundle. Muscle bundle. Muscle fiber. Muscle fiber. Myofibril. Myofibril. Myofilament. Myofilament. Endomysium. Endomysium. Paramysium. Paramysium. Epimysium. Epimysium. Sternocleidomastoid muscle. Sternocleidomastoid muscle. Scalenus muscle. Scalenus muscle. Suboccipital muscle. Suboccipital muscle. Pectoralis major muscle. Pectoralis major muscle. Pectoralis minor muscle. Pectoralis minor muscle. Subclavius muscle. Subclavius muscle. Serratus anterior muscle. Serratus anterior muscle. Intercostal muscle. Intercostal muscle. Diaphragm. Diaphragm. External oblique muscle of abdomen. External oblique muscle of abdomen. Internal oblique muscle of abdomen. Internal oblique muscle of abdomen. Rectus abdominis muscle. Rectus abdominis muscle. Transversus abdominis muscle. Transversus abdominis muscle. Quadratus lumborum muscle. Quadratus lumborum muscle. Trapezius muscle. trapezius muscle, levator scapulae muscle, levator scapulae muscle, rhomboid muscle, rhomboid muscle, latissimus dorsi muscle, latissimus dorsi muscle, erector spinae muscle, erector spinae muscle, multifidus muscle, multifidus muscle, deltoid muscle, deltoid muscle, supraspinatus muscle, supraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus muscle, infraspinatus muscle, teres minor muscle, teres minor muscle, teres major muscle, teres major muscle, subscapularis muscle, subscapularis muscle, biceps brachii muscle, biceps brachii muscle, coracobrachialis muscle, coracobrachialis muscle, brachialis muscle, brachialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, brachioradialis muscle, triceps brachii muscle, triceps brachii muscle, anconeus muscle, anconeus muscle, pronator teres muscle, pronator teres muscle, pronator quadratus muscle, pronator quadratus muscle, supinator muscle, supinator muscle, psoas major muscle, psoas major muscle, psoas minor muscle, psoas minor muscle, iliacus muscle, iliacus muscle, gluteus maximus muscle, gluteus maximus muscle, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, tensor fasciae lati muscle, tensor fasciae lati muscle, sartorius muscle, sartorius muscle, quadriceps femoris muscle, quadriceps femoris muscle, hamstring muscle, hamstring muscle, pectineus muscle, pectineus muscle, adductor longus muscle, adductor longus muscle, adductor brevis muscle, adductor brevis muscle, adductor magnus muscle, adductor magnus muscle, gracilis muscle, gracilis muscle, tibialis anterior muscle, tibialis anterior muscle, peroneus longus muscle, peroneus longus muscle, fibularis longus muscle, fibularis longus muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, soleus muscle, soleus muscle, myalgia, myalgia, myodynia, myodynia, myocele, myocele, hyperkinesia, hyperkinesia, spasm, spasm, cramp, cramp, rigidity, rigidity, tremor, tremor, myasthenia, myasthenia, hypotonia, hypotonia, myotonia, myotonia, contracture, contracture, paraplegia, paraplegia, paresis, paresis, tetraparesis, tetraparesis, tetraplegia, tetraplegia, myositis, myositis, tendinitis, tendinitis, claudication, claudication, polymyositis, polymyositis, myasthenia gravis, myasthenia gravis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, torticollis, torticollis, leiomyoma, leiomyoma, leiomyosarcoma, leiomyosarcoma, rhabdomyoma, rhabdomyoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, lipoma, lipoma, liposarcoma, liposarcoma, fasciectomy, fasciectomy, myotomy, myotomy, myopathy, myopathy, myoplasty, myoplasty, anti-inflammatory agent, anti-inflammatory agent, antipyretic, antipyretic, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug, analgesic, analgesic, narcotic analgesic, narcotic analgesic,